about ecosystem services and this project in particular. Some of the problems and objectives of this research. I'm going to describe to you the framework we developed to link ecosystem services, or link impacts due to stressors, anthropogenic stressors to ecosystem services. Talk about the workshop that we held to focus this on acid deposition, and then developing better stories for communicating these issues to the public. So first off, the National Park Service. You may know us from national parks such as Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Tetons. There are over 413 national park units in the U.S. right now, and they've been developed to preserve biological, geologic, and cultural resources across the U.S. In 2015, there were over 300 million visitors who came to individual national parks, and this year being the National Park Centennial, I think that number increased significantly. The mission in general of the National Park Service is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources for this and future generations. And so we're really looking at the current impact as well as long-term impacts to these protected lands. The Air Resources Division may be less known to most people. We're part of the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. We're one of 12 different divisions who are like the scientific arm of the Park Service, all focused on different impacts to different aspects of the parks. The Air Resources Division basic mission is to breathe easy, see far, and let nature thrive. So we're focused on the visitor experience, and the ecosystems within the park. Within the division itself, we deal with policy, planning, permit review, monitoring of air pollutants, atmospheric research such as modeling, and ecosystem effects research as to what is happening in the parks. One of the nice things about the Air Resources Division is that air touches everything. And so it's impacting all of the different processes that occur in the parks. But one of the hard thing about it is that air comes from everywhere. And so sometimes we don't have direct control over what's causing these negative impacts. So why do we care about ecosystem services? As the National Park Service overall, it's becoming law. In October of 2015, there was a federal memorandum released that's leading federal agencies to discuss how they're incorporating ecosystem services into federal decision making. One of the benefits for us is it allows us to connect to visitors, employees, as well as other stakeholders, and to fully understand the impacts and trade-offs associated with the decisions. One of the other reasons that it's good for the Air Resources Division is because air isn't something that most park visitors think about unless it's really bad. And a lot of times they'll see it's bad when there's smoke or the visibility is an issue, but they don't really fully comprehend what's happening with it. So in general, one of the problems we're seeing in the parks is that the ecosystems are changing. We are experiencing climate change. They're changing due to air pollution, to increased fires, and then to direct habitat destruction and type conversion of ecosystems, which happens less in parks, but more in the federal lands outside of them. One of the problems with these changes is that the species that often change first with a change in these stressors are smaller, nondescript species that don't attract the public attention. Sometimes in the case of climate change, you get a cute little animal like the pika, which is being heavily infected by increasing alpine temperatures. But for the most part, when people think about diatoms, lichens, and small invasive grasses, they think, who cares? This isn't our problem. There's also a bit of a disconnect with the public between what scientists think and what the public understands in terms of science. I pulled these next two graphs off of the Gallup poll site. They're from 2015 or the 16 and 15, with just kind of showing how public awareness and and worry about climate change has changed over time. And while 97% of scientists are concerned about global warming, currently only 64% of the public are. The second one I thought was interesting, just kind of to highlight the difference in this one, is that how concerned are you that climate change will harm you personally? And I think that was just the important part of dealing with ecosystem services. It allows this personal connection to the changes that are occurring. The other aspect of it is that there's a wide range, this is just based on partisan differences, of who believes that's actually happening. And so I think one of the important things to note here is that we're probably going to have to tell different stories to reach the red dot than we are to reach the blue dot. And we need to be aware of our audiences as we're trying to relate the science that we're doing to the public. So the objectives of this project were to link changes due to a stressor, such as climate change or acid deposition or air pollution, to an ecosystem component that people care about, to move past that biological indicator. The second is to identify the groups of people who are being impacted by the changes. And the third was to develop narratives to communicate the science to a broader audience. So as you would expect, based on where we're presenting this, we're using the ecosystem services as this interpretive tool to the public. And ecosystem services, generally known as nature's benefits, are ecosystem components or processes that are appreciated by the general public and different outputs from the ecosystem or from the earth that people use. And these can range from appreciating the sight of a bird to water purification to timber harvested for houses. It's a broad range of endpoints. One of the most common categorization of ecosystem services comes from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which kind of breaks it down into 4 different types: supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. The other thing, I think when the public in general thinks about ecosystem services, they think about one thing. How are we monetizing the environment? What's it worth in a dollar value versus what does it mean just generally speaking? Within this work, we're trying to use a different categorization just because of some of the limits of something such as provisioning or cultural services, and that they could be or some of the supporting ones as well, it could be like an intermediate service where a provisioning service like pollination or photosynthesis can lead to growth of a tree or the persistence of a species within a community. So we try to focus on the concept of final ecosystem services, which are those components of nature directly enjoyed, consumed, or used to yield human well-being. And this kind of is that last thing that nature produces that that people use. And the benefit of doing this is that it helps to avoid double counting services. So when we are prescribing value to it, we're not going to be counting pollination as well as the trees that are pollinated, or the flowers and the honey that's produced through pollination, but just kind of counting that last thing that we can identify. So when we started this project, we had basically 3 boxes that we were looking at. We knew that our stressors were changing biological indicators. We knew that when biological indicators changed, they were going to create changes within the ecosystem, some kind of cascading effect. And we also knew that people benefit from some ecosystem process as potentially being changed. So what we did and created this framework, which we refer to as the STEPS framework by the random letters that we chose from the first looking at how the stress biological indicator, which is in our stressors module, We then looked at the change in that how that change in a biological indicator leads to, cascades through the ecosystem to lead to a change in an ecological endpoint through the ecological production function. And then finally, using that ecological endpoint to classify it as an ecosystem service using a set classification system. The change from the change due to a stressor to that final ecosystem service we refer to as a chain. And so there's like one chain of events that links the change in biological indicator to a beneficiary group of some kind. So the first step in the equation is this stressors module. And the stressor, we wanted to set this up so it can be used for any stressor that impacts environmental conditions. Generally, a stressor is not going to act directly on a species, like a biological species, although it can in some cases. But often there's like this chemical component, often unseen or difficult to measure within the system. That chemical component will then impact a biological species, and then we as scientists can measure this change in biological species to understand how the stressor is the first thing noticed and measured within the system. We kind of looped all this together because a lot of times we can look at gradients and looking at change along the gradient and change in species along that same gradient, or whether that gradient be time or distance. For each of the throughout this, I'm going to be talking about a couple different SOS scores. So SOS stands for strength of science. And so each of the components that we identify here, that are based on scientific literature that shows these changes occur. So the SOS stressor score addresses the varying levels of uncertainty in the stressor indicator relationship. We classified these in 3 groups of high, medium, and low. Whether there are multiple supporting sources that this stressor causes a change in the biological indicator, if there is modeled or conflicting responses, or if the change is based on expert opinion or unpublished data, or if you transfer data from one ecosystem to another where similar species are present but it hasn't been measured directly. The next step is moving from that biological indicator to through the ecological production function. These are the cascading ecosystem effects that occur when that first species changes. The ecological production function can have 0 to n steps, but the longer you get away from the initial change, the more likely other things are going to be competing to change those downstream effects. The 0 steps, sometimes those changes in biological indicators are things that people would care about directly. And so when the stressor changes something like that, there's no need to have an ecological production function because that component is already valued by the public. And then the final component of the chain we labeled as the ecological endpoint, which is what is used, appreciated, or valued by humans. Within each of these steps, we also identified an SOS score just to identify the scientific publications that represent the strength of one component influencing the second component within the chain. This basically leads us to a series of documentation of the cause and effect. We then averaged all of those effect scores together to understand the general strength of that relationship between the change in the indicator and the change in the endpoint. The next step in the chain is identifying classifying the environmental component and classifying the user group who interacts with that component. I think it's important for us to understand which user groups are interacting because it provides the endpoint of who we're reaching out to in these situations. So we wanted direct interaction between a beneficiary and the ecosystem, identifies the group, which allows us to, in the future, identify metrics of understanding the important aspects of the change that we need to be measuring. It also facilitates direct communication and collaboration between natural and social scientists as we figure out how best to interact with the affected parties. The last value we calculate is the SOS chain score, and this links together the SOS stressor with all of the effect scores and creates an average value for the entire chain. Within that, we also identify the strength of science of the weakest link, because, well, as many people say, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And this is important because, yeah, sometimes you have very strong science up until one point where you assume there's a connection there, but that hasn't been published on, but can allow us to focus on those to fill in research needs and truly understand the system we're working with. From there, we kind of identified as this black box of measures of human well-being. We want to take these chains and start to find a way to value the different, value our outputs as within a broader context. And I'll talk, that's been outside the initial scope of this project, but as this is finished up, we're looking forward to developing this part further. And so basically what we attempted to do was identify the supply side from the ecosystem to society and classify it in a way that all parties who are potentially affected by the changes are enumerated. And then the demand side, we're hoping to work in the future to figure out the details of what's going on there. So in doing this, we developed a case study, which was an air quality and ecosystem services workshop. This was held in February of 2015. I believe had 27 participants, which were land managers, scientists, and economists. And through this, we published a workshop report that kind of gives a broad overview of how we got together, how these processes were dealt with, and how we tried to do what we're talking about today. The stressor in question that we used at the workshop was acid deposition. And acid deposition is mostly made up of sulfur and nitrogen that has been released from power stations or combustion, motor vehicles, or potentially livestock. These emissions come off of and out of these processes. They're traveled through general air mass movements and are deposited either through dry deposition directly to the surface of the ecosystem, or interact with rain and are rained in to the ecosystem. One of the common forms of wet deposition that you're probably familiar with is acid rain. And while we have significantly decreased the amount of acid rain in the U.S. over the last 30 years, there's still enough that it is changing ecosystems. Particularly what we used was exceedances of critical loads of acid deposition. So when you add a little bit of, with your garden, if you add a little bit of nitrogen to it, you're probably not going to see all that much different, a little bit of fertilizer. But when you add a lot of, just like you add the right amount or just a lot of fertilizer, you're going to start seeing a lot of change occurring. Your plants are going to grow a little bit faster. You're going to change which species are dominant, and you're most likely, if any of your gardeners out there, you're going to get a few more weeds at first that you're going to have to pull out. So the critical load is the threshold of deposition below which specified harmful ecological effects do not occur. Generally speaking, we don't treat our national parks like gardens. We want to preserve them as they have always been. And so by adding nitrogen, which is a fertilizer, we're changing the competitive relationships of the species in the parks, generally to the detriment of a normally functioning ecosystem. Within the workshop, we looked at 4 different modes of response to deposition. With nitrogen, you generally have, on the right-hand side of this, this diagram, you have eutrophication. Eutrophication occurs across the U.S., but is a larger problem in the West. Aquatic eutrophication can lead to changes in aquatic species, kind of like the general algal blooms that you'll see in a lake. In terrestrial eutrophication, we have losses of lichen as well as invasive species, like these different community patterns changing. Then we had acidification, which acidification of stream waters is leading to loss of aquatic species, and acidification of terrestrial species is changing the soil biota and changing the soil structure, which changes plant growth. And the acidification problems have been focused on the East Coast due to the amount of sulfur deposition that's occurred there. So there's 2 general responses by biological indicators to this increased deposition. They can either increase in growth if they have like a fertilizer effect, or if one of their competitors has a negative growth effect, or they can decrease in growth. They can also have no effect. Some species are more tolerant to changes in nutrient levels. When these things happen, it can lead to a loss of the species from the environment. It can lead to a change in species composition if one species grows a lot faster, or it can disrupt food web dynamics when that species is no longer there. The plant where a pollinator used to be is no longer there. Then the birds are potentially messed up. The picture on the right is of invasive grasses in the desert in Southern California. This is some of my graduate research showing that generally the desert at this time would be full of colors and lots of green native plants, but instead in this area of high deposition, we had a monoculture of this invasive grass that has the potential to change many levels of the ecosystem outside of it. The base data that we used in starting this process and within each of these groups is the National Critical Loads Database, which is managed by the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. And this is a compilation of all the empirical and calculated critical loads and information on many regional and national scale projects. And so this is kind of that starting point, and what allowed us, why we had chosen to work from this space was we had a very strong science in the stressor category of where we were, and then we were kind of focusing on the downstream effects. An example of what these critical load maps would look like, so this is from the National Park Service Air Resources Division website, kind of showing different areas of the forests in the west that are in exceedance of a critical load. So there's more deposition than it takes to cause a change in the ecosystem. The red areas are above the critical load, and the blue areas are below. So there's a lot of area in the west that is at risk for changes due to deposition. So once we had all these changes in biological indicators, we moved to the ecological production function and really looked into what happens next. We looked at food chain responses. Is there increase in fire risk, increase in erosion, potential for increased pest infestation? Each of these we kind of did a literature review to make sure that each of these links were based in science and linked back to previous research. In the final category, in the final ecosystem services, we chose to use the final ecosystem goods and services classification system. We did this because it provided a distinct environmental class and distinct human beneficiary class that uses that environmental component. And it also had a set structure of beneficiary classes that allowed us to kind of group different parts of society together and have some consistency in our results. So instead of classifying different native plant associations, we would put those people in as experiencers and users of the environment. This also allowed having these distinct classes to identify distinct metrics and avoided double counting of services. While we could associate multiple different beneficiaries with a single environmental endpoint, by having those classified together, we would understand that they're all somewhat unique. So to give an example of what one of these chains looks like, or what the process we went through was, I'm going to take you to the coastal sage scrub of Southern California. One of the well-studied critical loads of the area was looking at increased invasive grass to native forb ratio. And this basically means that with more nitrogen deposition, the invasive grasses grow faster than the native forbs, and as in that picture I showed earlier, outcompete them. So we start with, as invasive grasses grow, we have an increased fire fuel load. With increased fire fuel load, we have increased fire frequency. With increased fire frequency, we have a loss of shrub cover. This picture is probably a little small, but on the the upper left of the picture is an area that had burned once about 50 years ago, and it had recovered to its full shrub cover in the past. The middle of the picture, you can see a little bit darker brown, had burned twice, 30 years after the first burn, and has partially recovered. But the third picture, which had burned 3 times, and the last burn being 2 years after the second, did not have any shrub recovery at all. So as we lose this shrub cover and have increased invasive species, we lose the California gnatcatcher, which is a threatened species in California, from the environment. And being something that on the endangered species list or on the threatened species list is of significance both to the state and to bird watchers and such. So using that loss of California gnatcatcher as our ecological endpoint, so this was the ecological production function there. We tied that to multiple beneficiaries who would be potentially impacted by this excess nitrogen deposition. This is what it looks like kind of more structurally. You can see starting from the left, we have the critical load exceedance. We have a biological indicator in the red box. The purple boxes represent the multiple ecological production functions, which lead to the green circles, which are the ecological endpoints. And so we identified 5 different ecological endpoints and 11 different beneficiaries. And so if you were to follow each of these chains individually, it would lead to 45 different chains just due to the change in one biological indicator. So as I mentioned, we had 4 different subsets in those 4 different modes of response, and each of them created their own number of links to ecosystem services. Each of them went on the one thing that was good about this workshop is that we gave people this framework and we told them the general plan, but then they all went about it in a slightly different way. And so we totaled up, identified 44 different changes in biological indicators and linked that to 77 different ecological endpoints, and over 1,000 different chains identified, linking a change in air quality to a change in beneficiaries' interaction with the environment. These numbers aren't meant to be directly compared because of the different methods that were used. So this doesn't mean that terrestrial eutrophication is the most important impact, but we just identified that many links based on the methods used. So these next few slides will kind of identify what those differences look like. So the Terrestrial Eutrophication group decided to go all in and look at all the research that had been done within all the different ecoregions. So on the outsides, this moves from the outside going in. The outsides represent the different ecoregions moving into different habitats and then to the critical loads and in through the ecological production functions. So this was the most complex set of relationships developed within the groups and really highlighted like the broad brush stroke that this could be used for to really identify all of the impacts. Alternatively, the Terrestrial Acidification group just focused on 2 different species. They looked at the balsam fir, which is the top set of relationships, and the white ash, which is the bottom set of relationships. And one of the great things about this exercise was that it really highlighted how specific this could be used in a local setting. Like if you know that this one species is being impacted in your region, you could really you can identify those broader impacts instead of just what the Terrestrial Eutrophication group did was change in forest cover. This focuses on the individual species, the individual types of bird and animal species that respond to it, and specific groups that are impacted. The Aquatic Eutrophication group focused more mostly on a shift in the diatom community. And so they kind of focused on, which is the top half of the relationships here, and just kind of how the change in one set of species cascades through the environment. They had split theirs up into 3 different regions instead of, within the same community, with the same shift in diatoms in alpine lakes and regular lakes, and then in rivers and streams. So theirs is more water body type compared. And lastly, the aquatic acidification, they put a lot of their focus on kind of the physiological impacts, what are the chemical, they're looking at the chemical impacts and how are those chemical impacts impacting the function of these species in the ecosystem. And these are these orange blocks that weren't present in the other diagrams. So this is a results slide showing the total count of chains from each beneficiary group. So on the x-axis is a list of all the different groups that we identified, and on the y-axis is that the number of chains. So the first thing you notice is that there's this group on the left of that are all similarly more than the rest. And these represent the non-consumptive users of the ecosystem. They have artists, spiritual celebrations, educators, researchers, people who care, experiencers and viewers, those people who come in and just have more of an emotional response to the area than an economic response. We then have more of our economic aspects on over here, which are still higher than a lot of the other groups, but are much less so. And part of this distinction is that since these are done, we're looking at direct negative effects of a stressor. So an ecosystem itself can potentially produce many more timber and wastewater treatment type of things, but we're focused on just how those things change due to the stressor at hand, not the total production from the ecosystem. We then took the strength of science scores and summed those together for all of the groups. So we'll start on the left is just the strength of science for the ecological production function, which is on the x-axis, and the frequency on the y-axis. You'll notice here that there are many, because we're focused in a group of experts, there's a highly weighted frequency towards the science is extremely well known. with a score of 1 for most of these relationships. The Terrestrial Eutrophication group, having spread out their knowledge far into many different ecoregions, ran into more through less defined science, which kind of reduced the rank of some of the ecological production functions. The graph on the right is the SOS chain score. So this is the average of all of the effects within the ecological production function plus that of the stressor. And you'll notice that there's a general shift to the left of the frequency on some of these, indicating that the stressors are less well known, like the full impact of the stressor is less well known in some of these situations. And I think that's important because it allows us to differentiate those where the downstream effects are well understood, but where we might have less knowledge about the stressor, kind of is focusing in on where we need to focus our efforts, our future research efforts. I mentioned previously identifying the weakest link to the chain, and so this is kind of showing one of the downsides of the equation that we have, but the importance of taking this weakest link in the chain length into consideration. On the x-axis, we have the lowest score of an individual chain, whether it be low, medium, or high, and then on the y-axis, we have the distribution of SOS chain scores for each of those that had a weakest link. And so while the averages of each of the categories is in the proper direction of chains with the weakest link of low or have a lower average score than those of medium or high, you will notice that some of the ones with a low score do rank out overall higher than those of the medium score. And so we're looking into new ways to analyze this using the length of the chain, as well as incorporating this weakest link score a little bit stronger, just to make sure that those are utilized in management decisions, realizing some of the uncertainty that exists. So two of the ways that we're planning on using these strength of science scores is, one in research, is that identifying those chains with a low strength of science can identify areas of research needs, especially if there's a low score associated with a large group of beneficiaries. Secondly, in management, we're going to use the scores to identify where a large range of stakeholders are impacted, especially when we know the science is strong behind there. And those are the ones we can communicate better to the stakeholders as far as what's going on. This allows managers to prioritize restoration based on the broader impacts as well as the groups who are impacted, and identify those chains with low strength of science scores that need further evaluation. So now that we had all this information, we have 1,077 relationships between air quality and ecosystem services. We needed to figure out, we wanted to find a way to develop, to discover personal relevance in relationship to the change. This was, what we did was try to develop narratives that connect with the beneficiary groups, tell a better story about the science rather than focusing on the diatoms and the lichens directly, talk about what those things are changing and how people can relate to them. The key to this was we wanted to make sure these were based in science, but kept a focus on something the group was already familiar with. So we didn't have to explain the whole thing, but say, if you like this, you're going to care that air quality is affecting this. So the first one goes back to the case study I talked about with the coastal sage scrub. And we labeled this one, How a Rain of Fertilizer Caused a Rain of Fire. And as I mentioned with the garden before, as you would fertilize your garden to change the the rate at which your plants grow, nitrogen from the atmosphere is deposited to ecosystems and fertilizes the natural system. This causes some things to grow faster than others. If those things that grow faster are invasive plants, they cause fire to increase. When fire increases, it increases the risk of fire to your homes. And having that increased fire risk is a direct result, or can be associated with atmospheric pollution. Additionally, focusing this on the different beneficiary groups of the bird watchers, there's the ability to tell the story in a different way, where those people may be coming from a different area. It might not be a direct relationship to their homes that they're concerned about, but the loss of the species of interest to them. And so by talking about the fire and the lack of shrubs, and keeping the focus more on the California gnatcatcher, saying that with the change in grasses, you have increased fire, which leads to loss of habitat for these iconic species that you're looking for. Our next story is about ash in an American pastime. So the white ash is highly impacted by acid rain. As acid rain increases and as nutrients are leached out of the soil, the trees start to grow slower. And when trees are growing slower, they change the amount of air pockets that are in them. White ash is one of the main tree species used to create baseball bats, the Louisville slugger. The reason that it's used is because it has the right number of air pockets and the right density of wood to make them flex when the ball is hit. The more you change the growth patterns and the more you change the quality of that wood, the less likely you are to have a bat that's not going to splinter or to break. And as I mentioned earlier, we've had very strong very large decreases in acid rain in the last 30 years, which I'm really appreciative of because it kept the Cubs' bats on fire for the last 3 games of the World Series and allowed them to flourish in that environment. And so the last one I'm going to talk about today is how acidification cancels Christmas. The balsam fir, which was the other species we focused on in the Aquatic Acidification group, is one of the very popular Christmas trees. And so as acid rain increases, the growth of these balsam firs decrease, as well as the quality of the branches. And so unless you want every Christmas to be a Charlie Brown Christmas, we need to bring down acid rain so we have healthy and vigorous looking Christmas trees. And in association with that, Easter could be canceled too, because the snowshoe hare is a species that uses the balsam fir in the wild for cover. As the branches die back and as the trees grow slower, there's less cover for the snowshoe hare to avoid its predators, and the snowshoe hare populations can decline in these high acid rain environments. So we started developing a couple different stories based on this, based on ecosystem services and changes due to air quality. One of the Forest Service is putting out this new poster called Celebrating Lichens, and on the back of this poster it has 40 different ways that lichens impact ecosystem services, and a lot of great stories like these that kind of link it to things people care about. But so we're trying to first develop new stories and new ways to associate people with these changes. One of the things we need to do next is put this over to the demand side, really seek out the stakeholders, get better ideas of what they're actually looking for at the national parks. We want to spread this out to looking at other stressors, identify synergistic effects of stressors, and then input new science into this framework. So the valuation, one of the things, especially with these non-consumptive users, is finding a good method of identifying both monetary and non-monetary value to the ecosystems. That it's not just baseball bats, it's not just timber, but it's that emotional connection people have. It's the cultural resources that are being preserved, and really getting a better classification system around that so that we can really so we can measure the changes in the ecosystem correctly. There are other, also there's a lot of interest in kind of figuring out these broader impacts of other stressors. One of our colleagues is looking into mercury deposition and how that's potentially changing ecosystem services like fish consumption and ecosystem health in general. Climate change is a very obvious one, as we're already seeing many changes within the parks. I met a researcher who's looking at fog on the West Coast, and she's was kind of thinking that kind of associated with climate change, how a loss of fog in the redwood forest could potentially have drastic effects to that community, as well as other toxics that could find their way to human health. And so once we have more of these relationships elucidated, we're able to identify more synergistic effects of the stressors. This is an example from McDonald et al. From last year in PLS1, which kind of links the synergistic effects of acid deposition and climate change on the brook trout. So the brook trout is highly influenced by low acid neutralizing capacity within streams, where deposition is higher up on the mountaintop. So high in the mountains, the brook trout is being pushed out and pushed down to the lower elevations due to acidification. But on the lower elevations, climate change is warming up the stream, so it's no longer there's no longer habitat on the lower ends of the mountains for the brook trout to survive. So it's being pushed up into the center, a really small area left, being squeezed out of its natural area. So as these two things compound on one another, it could potentially quickly move, completely remove the available habitat for the species. And this is just one example in a highly studied area, but there are many others that have the potential to be pulled out. One of the final things is that, as you may have noticed, we're currently only looking at the fact that one species changes another one. Most of the time, this is going to be a negative interaction because we're looking at species losses in the ecosystem. These all are going to be changing at different rates. As one species increases, another may decrease a little bit slower. And these are fine-tuned relationships that we're looking to add to this model in the future, so we can really understand the amount of change that's occurring at any time. Within that, as species are lost in the system, we need to understand a little bit more about the system, and especially local systems where are there replacement species available within the food web, or is there something, a positive species that can be used by the pollinator can use. And then with acid deposition, there's a chance for this change to be reversible. Like, can we take an action to reset the system back where it is, where in terms of climate change and this continuous change that's occurring, there may not be an opportunity to go back. So really identifying where these points are where we can take action to help improve the system. And I just wanted to highlight that this is only one piece of the puzzle that we're using to understand ecosystem health and relate the scientific work of the National Park Service to the public. And one of the things, the puzzle of the Earth and understanding the environment is very complex. And what we're hoping here is to engage more people in helping us put that puzzle together. If we have more hands and more minds engaged in the process, we're more likely to make significant changes to help solve this problem. And so with that, I ask that if you have any stories, you have anything that you relate to, how you relate to the environment and these changes, please send them to me. I'd love to have more examples of how ecosystem change is affecting you, and hopefully we can work together in the future kind of helping to spread the message. And thanks for your attention.